we're talking about energy all over this morning. It's quite a significant point. And the argument I've been making this morning is, in a strange way, energy sounds quite a dry subject, but actually almost all of our problems or major problems are connected to energy in terms of geopolitics, in terms of cost of living, in terms of environment. They all come back to what our energy strategy should be. Kwasi Kwarteng admitted on this programme that his solution may bring down, he said he can't guarantee this, may bring down bills in 3 or 4 years by ramping up renewables and bringing nuclear to the forefront. Will Self, is a strategy that only brings down bills in 3 or 4 years what we need right now?
I think that's probably pie in the sky anyway. I mean, the problem is the half-life of Tory governments is about 2 years, the half-life of governments in general, and the half-life of the kind of fissile material used in nuclear reactors is about 15,000 years. I mean, the problem for our nuclear program was that we ran it down years ago. The problem for our nuclear program is that oppositions and problems about reactor construction have dogged it anyway. Look at Hinkley Point for years and years and years and years. And the idea that Kwarteng announces this strategy and we're somehow going to reboot our nuclear program in 2 or 3 years is pie in the sky. We haven't even got the requisite number of nuclear specialist physicists to work in the program. We've run down our education at that level. We haven't got a nuclear program like that. And new kinds of reactor doesn't solve that problem either.
And we're not going to turn to China. I asked Ed Miliband that. We had the Chinese have some capabilities in this area, and for security reasons, probably rightly, many would argue rightly, we've said we don't want you in this country doing it.
We've just thrown them out of 5G. Are we going to let them back in to deal with the most poisonous material known to humans? It's ridiculous.
What do you think, Rachel? Is nuclear the answer? And if it is, can it be done quick enough? Because there is this problem that Will's alluding to. That there's an electoral cycle problem here. Some of these problems are structural that require us to do things that will hopefully make things better 10, 15, 20 years from now, when none of the people currently making the decisions will be empowered to answer to them.
That's completely right. And nuclear is, if anything, the longest possible way of dealing with it. So looking at the Hinkley Point reactor, they started talking about that in 2009, and it might start this producing energy in 2026, and it's going to cost more than £20 billion. So this isn't either a quick or a cheap solution. The idea that any more energy is going to come online in 3 or 4 years and bring bills down is just completely absurd, if that's what Kwasi Kwarteng is saying. For me, what was so interesting about this energy strategy is that the government has basically caved into its own backbenchers on onshore wind, which is a much quicker and cheaper and more renewable solution. But because of the sort of fear of Tory MPs and the NIMBYs, Boris Johnson, who only a few weeks ago was saying that was fantastic, that was the solution, Britain was going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, he's now completely backed off any idea of relaxing planning laws on onshore wind farms. So that, for the politics of that, for me, were really interesting. And instead, they've kicked it down the track to this kind of somebody else's problem, nuclear power stations maybe in 20 years, effectively.
Now, before we criticise NIMBYs, let's all have to declare whether we are them or not. I said to Ed Miliband, would you like to live next to a wind farm? He said, yes, he would. Rachel, would I? I don't know. I'm not sure I'd object to it that much. I mean, are they just modern windmills? We've had windmills across the landscape for millennia. Is it that bad to have rather sleek, rather beautiful, white, whirry things adorning the landscape? I've never actually lived near one, so I don't know the answer to that. But would you allow one in your backyard, Rachel?
Well, I think they're really beautiful, actually. When you see the big farms in California, I think they're really lovely. As you say, I haven't lived near one, so I don't know how noisy they are. That would be the only thing that would bother me. But in terms of the visuals, I think they're rather beautiful.
Well,
absolutely. I think they're lovely. They look like huge kind of knitting. When you see a huge pattern, it's as if the wind is knitting the land. They're lovely things. I've no time for the NIMBYists whatsoever. The spectacle. Ooh, I want to look at my bosky little English landscape, which is an anthropic landscape anyway.
Yeah.
There's no square foot of this country that isn't shaped by humankind already. And I want to sit looking at this anthropic landscape while my bottom burns off because I can't face a wind turbine. It's absurd.
Nobody wants their bottom to burn.
But that's becoming the Saudi Arabia of wind. Rachel started it.
Let's move it on, shall we? And tackle another one of the stories in most of the front pages this morning, which is Mrs. Sunak, Chancellor's wife. Kwasi Kwarteng also defended Rishi Sunak's response to questions over his wife's non-domicile status this morning, saying the Chancellor is totally right. I mean, what do you guys make of the optics of this? Will, when the public have such a growing tax burden, it came on the same day as most people's taxes went up?
I think it's a lousy optic on both fronts. It's not just the domestic tax bill, it's also the Russians, the vulgar Russians. Let's face it. I mean, there is an equivalence in the public mind, surely, between one non-dom and another, and the government's weakness in granting non-dom status to people that they're now sanctioning. So, obviously, the Chancellor's wife is not in the same category, but it looks like an alignment in the public mind. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, rich woman doesn't pay much tax, shock. It really isn't. This has been going on for a very long time, that very wealthy people pay much less tax than poorer people. The tax changes tend to be regressive when governments are making a big noise. So, I think they'll weather this one out. We've all known that Sunak was married to a very, very wealthy person for a very long time now.
Rachel, what do you make of it? Akshata Murthy's saying, she's got this non-domicile status because of where she was born. She doesn't want to have to give it up. She wants to be able to keep it. There is no way to keep it and pay taxes on anything earned outside of this country. And there are some who say, well, it's not really fair to go after the Chancellor's wife. He declared it when he joined the Treasury. He's made it very clear inside government that this was his situation. I mean, what do you make of that argument?
Well, I agree. I don't like the idea of going after people's spouses. I don't think they're responsible for what their political partners do. But I do think in this case, the problem is it's a choice. And most people in the Red Wall constituencies or any constituencies don't have the choice about where they pay tax. They don't have the wealth involved or the luxury to make that choice. And the British taxpayer has lost out as a result of this because she hasn't paid taxes in this country on her foreign income. So that's there is a sort of consequence and a sort of public interest in that, I think, in a way that there might not be in some other situations. And we don't know where she obviously has paid tax on her foreign income, but we don't know where. Is that in India or is that in somewhere like the Cayman Islands? So we don't know exactly what the consequences of that decision are. But I think the big thing is that it looks like there's a sort of decision. Rishi Sunak and his family are potentially benefiting from a decision that is not available to most people. Is
the Sunak gloss wearing off? Is that the other thing? Is that the other narrative that's emerging from this? That he kind of, I'll ask you, Rachel, first, then Will, that he had a good pandemic in the sense that he was the man who turned all the taps on. And then there was always a suggestion at some point he's going to have to be the person that says no because he'd spent so much money during the pandemic. And he built his reputation. Do you remember those Twitter graphics that every time there was generosity from the government, Rishi Sunak's signature was beneath it? You get what you need to be furloughed. Thank Rishi. We're looking after things. Thank Rishi. Was this inevitable, maybe?
Well, and there isn't sort of now your taxes are going up. Thank Rishi. Now your universal credit's been cut. Thank Rishi. He did get the credit for a lot of the generosity. And it's inevitable, I think, when you've got a cost of living crisis, partly driven, I'd say, by some of the decisions he's made, particularly for people on benefits that haven't gone up, that he's going to pay the price for that. And then compounding that is the fact that he is incredibly rich. And that sits uneasily with the sort of poverty that some people are now experiencing. The Iceland boss the other day saying that people are turning down potatoes in food banks because they can't afford the fuel to cook them. So there is really terrible, devastating poverty in some parts of the country. So, the chance of being able to buy an incredibly expensive coffee cup or his wife being able to choose where she pays her tax just sits uneasily with that.
Hasn't it been ever thus, Will, that people who make decisions, the nature of power has wealth attracted to it either because of power or the wealthy are attracted to power and have greater access to it? I imagine in the history of British society, rich people have made decisions that affect poor people for the entirety that there has been a British society.
I think one of the paradoxes about Sunak, of course, is he's not altogether to the manner born. I mean, he's a nice middle-class boy and the kind of son of doctors, as I remember it. He's bootstrapped his way by becoming a Wickhamist and by starting to consort, and then through hedge funds. So he's made himself wealthy on betting against the economy in that way. And I think, yes, Rachel's right. I mean, back to that word, which I don't particularly like, optics. It don't look good. But I think the paradox is that the shine on Rishi was always that he'd risen without trace. And the thing is, now you look at the trace, it starts to, and Rachel makes the right point. The issues around poverty as we move through this year are going to become acute. There really is a kind of almost Malthusian gap now between what's on offer in terms of benefits and what the cost of living is going to be. And it's a bit like the environmental crisis. It's one of those things where, like that movie over Christmas, people keep pointing up in the air at this giant thing that's coming towards us and then getting on with their business and buying another takeaway latte or something. But it is acute, and people are going to be in big trouble. And then I think there is no shine on Rishi. It's all come off, in fact.
Well, let's move on to a billionaire that I genuinely find objectionable. And there's been a cause of much mockery from the production staff.
He's back.
He's back. Elon. Oh God, I promise
You
we wouldn't
said
talk.
we wouldn't talk
I promise
about him
we wouldn't talk
again.
about Elon Musk again, and we've done it. I
You've
apologise.
literally been the one to bring him up.
I know. I'm just reading out from a script, so I will defend myself by being only an automaton, mindless automaton. But let's talk about Elon Musk.
Are you in fact made by Elon Musk?
He's sponsored by Elon Musk the number of times you said his name.
I find Elon Musk annoying. I think he's a fundamentally annoying person. He's a disruptor, but maybe that's a good thing. Will Self. He rose because he basically sold his business to PayPal. He then became a big investor in Tesla. Tesla is a broadly good thing for the environment, many would argue. He's then taken that money, wants to send people into space, send himself into space. He now wants to dominate Twitter. He's into Bitcoin. Is he a good thing or a bad thing in your view, Will Self?
I mean, every era gets the weird kind of mathematical thing it deserves. The Greeks had the golden mean. Arguably, the age of industrialization was predicated on calculus. And Musk has made all his money off the non-factorability of large prime numbers. Somebody's going to crack it soon, and this Bitcoin and all of this encrypted finance is going to come crashing down. He's like he's the most Oz-like figure ever. I think that's why he obsesses you, Stig. I mean, there's absolutely, he's the nerd raised to the level of the nabob.
And is that a good thing? I agree with. I agree that's right, and I agree that I'm unhealthy in my regard, in my lack of regard for him. But is he a good thing or a bad thing, Rachel?
Well, I think he's fascinating. And so maybe both, but the energy, the narcissism, the sort of level of ambition. And for me, the thing I find really interesting is his Asperger's syndrome, which he talked about last year, didn't he, for the first time publicly. And I find it absolutely fascinating, the number of incredibly successful business leaders I've interviewed over the years who have some kind of dyslexia, autism, Asperger's. So Richard Branson, for example, he says he thinks his dyslexia, his really severe dyslexia, he left school at 15, and didn't know what a profit and loss was until he was 50. Somebody had to explain it to him. Couldn't understand numbers at all. He thinks he's a better businessman because of his dyslexia. It's more creative, a different way of thinking about the world. And there's something about Musk, because of that sort of single-minded focus, perhaps, because of the way his brain works, that makes him both very geeky, but also rather original. And that's, for me, is why he's quite intriguing.
That's a good point, but there's an ego there. Well, that's the other. I think it's the unattractiveness of the ego, and you see it with Bezos. I don't find it a coincidence that they all want to fly into space. Jeff Bezos with a giant willy-shaped rocket.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but
is that the first thing?
It's the first thing I think.
No,
yeah,
completely. This is a Prometheanism of the penis, no question about it. And also, blockchain and all of these technologies are fantastically environmentally destructive.
Yeah.
And the idea that Bezos and Musk are going to leave planet Earth behind while the rest of us frazzle is deeply unattractive. And, but as I say, every generation and era gets the robber baron it deserves. And I'm sure if we were up close, to Carnegie, we might have felt the same way despite the libraries. You can argue that the Silicon Valley nabobs dispense their largesse as well.
That's a really good point. I should say that none of us have lived near wind farms. Mariella Frostrup has. She's on at 1 o'clock and she shared her experience of it. And it's not a good one, guys. I've lived next door to one and the sound is indescribable when the wind is blowing. It can drive people crazy. It's so invasive. I certainly understand people's reluctance based on protecting their sanity.
Well, I take that, but people are so ignorant about how much space there is in this country and how much is built up and where we could put these wind farms. There are few people living there, to be frank, and it ill behooves ex-urbanites who perhaps have left over the pandemic because they could afford to downsize to moan about that fact, because once again it interferes with their bosky little vision of the country.
Yeah, that's not Mariella Frost we're talking about, of course.
Of course not.
It's other people. Great to speak. I've really enjoyed that. I feel like I can definitely confirm that for the last half hour of the programme we will not mention the words Elon or Musk.
A bit musky in here though, isn't it?
For God's sake.
It really went to places I didn't expect.
Yeah, no, we hold us to that. Will, Self and Rachel Sylvester, thank you so much for joining us.